Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. For the final session of this Washington History Seminar semester. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by historian Sheila Miyoshi Jager, The Other Great Game, The Opening of Korea and the Birth of Modern East Asia. We're also very fortunate to have with us two scholars, Sumi Terry and Michael Robinson, who will provide initial comments and launch our discussion. To all of you, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and have the privilege to co-chair this session with Eric Arneson of the National History Center and George Washington University. Eric is away today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Over the past decade plus, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical publications. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley for the National History Center for the AHA, and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters and welcome your support. Details on how to support the seminar, which is essentially a pro bono activity of our two organizations, will be available in the chat function right now, or you can simply go to our institutional websites. A quick technical note on the proceedings. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part, you have two ways to join this conversation. Our preferred way is for you to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality. You'll be queued, and once I call on you, you'll be asked to unmute yourself, and then you can join the conversation with your question or comment. You can also post a question or comment to the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I will put the question or comment to our panelists. With the preliminaries out of the way, it's now my great pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today, Sheila Miyoshi Jager, professor of history and East Asian studies at Oberlin College. Her books include Brothers at War, The Unending Conflict in Korea, Ruptured Histories, War Memory and the Post-Cold War in Asia, and Narratives of Nation Building, The Genealogy of Patriotism. Her latest book, The Other Great Game, The Opening of Korea and the Birth of Modern East Asia, published by Harvard just recently, will be the subject of discussion today. She's already working on a new book project, if I see that correctly, The Great War and East Asia, tells the story of China's, Japan's, and Korea's experiences in World War I. She's also working on a co-authored book with Jujul Kim entitled The Korean War and New History that is under contract with Cambridge University Press. She's the author of many articles and essays in scholarly and popular publications, including the New York Times, Politico, and Boston Globe, and has very kindly been involved in a good number of Wilson Center activities. So it's great to welcome you back to the Wilson Center and to the Washington History Seminar. Sheila, Zoom room is all yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Christian, and for the introduction, and thanks to the AHA and to the Wilson Center, and of course to Sumi Terry and Michael Robinson. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts. So as for Christian's guidance, I'll start with about 20 minutes or so of some framing comments on a few of the highlights and main themes of the book, and then a little bit about how and why I constructed the book the way I did. So let's start with how and why I wrote the book first. So I wrote the book as a narrative history, and this was my approach to my last book, Brothers at War. And I did this in part because I hope for some crossover appeal so that it can be accessible to both the general readers as well as to academic specialists. And also embedded within the decision to make it a narrative history was a plea for the role of contingency and agency in history. Of course, we know that many structural factors and tectonic plates of geopolitics play an important role in any history, but I wanted as much as possible to showcase this history as an unfolding process to the people who were living it, who were experiencing it, and who were shaping it. Another aspect of why I wrote it as a narrative history is to recapture the complexities of the political process itself, both the interpersonal nature of it, the feuds and the rifts among the political players, but also to showcase the many strong-willed personalities who populated this history. So now let's turn to why I wrote the book and its main themes and arguments. So first, the book was conceived as a first volume of a 4-volume project on war and conflict in East Asia, from the end of the Second Opium War to the Korean War. Now, volume 1, which is the subject of this book, looks at the period between 1860 and 1910, and then the series will conclude with my last book, Brothers at War, volume 4, about the ongoing Korean War, which brings the story up to the present day. Now, regarding the present volume, as in the Korean War setting half a century later, the geopolitical situation in late 19th century and early 20th century East Asia also involved problems surrounding a politically divided and volatile power that lay in the geostrategic center of the region, the Korean peninsula. Now, this book takes us back to this early period to explore how Korea's historical experience fundamentally intersected with the regional and international history at another critical time in East Asia's history. Now, the parallels between post-1945 East Asia and pre-1894 East Asia are pretty striking. We're all familiar with Mark Twain's dictum that history never repeats itself, but often does rhyme. And if there were any more uncanny examples of rhyming history, it is the ongoing problem of Korea for the regional powers. Now, in the buildup to the Sino-Japanese War, for example, Britain proposed dividing the peninsula in half, Japanese in the south, Chinese in the north, in order to prevent the outbreak of the war. 2 years later, in 1896, Yamagata Aritomo, one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration, came up with the proposal to divide the peninsula at the 38th parallel to settle the impending conflict over Korea with the Russians. And of course, the Russians also proposed dividing the peninsula at the 39th parallel in 1903, just before the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. Now, whether Dean Rusk or Charles Bonesteel were ever aware of this early history of the 38th parallel is not known. I've never come up with any evidence that they were, but it just goes to show that Korea's central role in this interstate rivalry among the great powers can be traced back to the late 19th century. So now let's turn to the main themes of the book. Like the Great Game struggle between Russia and Britain over India that existed for most of the 19th century, the other great game in East Asia over control of the Korean peninsula also gave rise to lasting rivalry and bloodshed among the regional powers. Now, the chessboard on which this other great game was played caused 2 major wars, the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, and then the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which changed the East Asian region and the world forever. Now, since ancient times, China had held this position of supremacy as the Middle Kingdom. By 1911, 1 year after Korea became a colony of Japan, the Qing dynasty collapsed and Meiji Japan rose up to take China's place as the dominant power in the region. So very broadly speaking, the book attempts to recast the story, well documented in past monographs, of China's decline as the dominant power in East Asia and the simultaneous rise of Meiji Japan, focusing on Korea's role in this transformational process. Now, turning to some of the main arguments in the book, the first is historiographical. Now, in most histories of the late 19th and early 20th century East Asia, and I'm thinking of Martina Deuchler's Confucian Gentlemen and Barbarian Envoys, or more recently, Stephen Platt's Imperial Twilight, the decades of the 1840s and 1850s are seen as decisive. This is the period of the First Opium War. It's the period of Commodore Perry's expedition to Japan, when both China and Japan were experiencing the existential threat to the old order as they confronted the foreboding presence of Western gunboats on their shores. So in this historiographical framing of events, it's really the contest between the East and the West that becomes the source and driver of change to the old order. What's new in this book is the explicit focus on bringing into the political power competition of Anglo, US, Chinese, and Japanese game, a much more detailed and comprehensive inclusion of the Russian Empire in this process. Thus, while I'm going over some old ground, I've tried to enliven and recast this very important geopolitical realignment with a much more incisive argument that that includes Russian interests and actions in East Asia, heretofore only given very light treatment in the general narrative. So by beginning my story with Russia's eastward expansion, I place Russia at the center of this changing regional dynamic among the three major Asian powers as they confronted each other over the non-power, which was Korea. So the Treaty of Peking, which was signed in 1860 between China and Russia, was therefore critical because it was then that Russia came in possession of this huge swath of Chinese territory which brought the Russians in direct contact with Koreans for the first time in history. So how Koreans, how Chinese, how Japanese reacted to this new Russian threat on Korea's border is really the starting point of my story. So rather than focus on the East-West dynamic, my focus is really a regional history that is an examination of how Russia, Japan, China, and Korea interacted with each other with inputs from the Western powers. Now, the second main theme has to do with Korea's role in this history. Whereas older treatments of this period have focused on the interstate rivalry of the great powers over their varying interests on the Korean peninsula, I focused on Korean domestic politics as the main driver of change in the region. And more specifically, I focused on the familial struggle that began really in the early 1870s, when for the first time in Korea's history, there were in effect two ruling kings in Korea. There was King Kojong, and then his wife regent, his father regent, the Taewongun. And so my thesis is that Korea's two-king problem, and here I would also include Queen Min, who was a formidable political player in her own right, set the stage for this pattern of divided politics that gave rise to Korea's fractured polity and by extension, the region's instability. So for example, the 1882 Imo uprising brought about a complete transformation in China's relationship with Korea, which was brought about by the attempt by the Taewongun to oust his son from power. It also changed Korea's relationship to Japan and led to the dispatch of Japanese troops to the peninsula for the first time since Japan's invasion of Korea in the late 16th century. Now, these dispatches of Chinese and Japanese troops had come about not by any specific designs on Korea by either China or Japan, but by the chaotic domestic situation in the peninsula. You had opposing Korean political groups, in other words, invited foreign powers into Korea to help resolve domestic disputes. At the same time, foreign powers exploited Korea's domestic divisions for their own imperialist aims. So the opening of Korea that appears in the subtitle of my book is thus evoked ironically, not only as a throwback to 19th century depictions of Korea as a hermit kingdom, but also to underscore how they continue to influence the way in which Korea is often, particularly North Korea, is often perceived in contemporary policy circles. Far from being in the waiting room of history to be acted upon by the great powers, the so-called shrimp among whales, I've tried to show that Koreans were very much the makers and shakers of this history and were in effect co-authors of their own tragedy. Now, considering Korea's domestic divisions in politics as the source of regional conflict, key events in the history of Japanese imperialism also assume a new character. For example, the 1873 debate over the proposed invasion of Korea, the so-called Seikhanmun debate, has long been viewed as the starting point for over 3/4 of a century of Japanese expansionism. Yet the true significance of the controversy lies not in its relationship to Japan's later continental ambitions. The principal importance of this debate had to do with Japan's own nation-building efforts. So just as the earlier Tokugawa had looked to relations with the outside powers, and in particular to Korea, to bestow legitimacy upon his regime, so too did early Meiji leaders hope to obtain the same external confirmation of their new polity through a renewal of contacts with Korea. Now, the Korean court's rude rebuke of the Japanese overtures thus represented something much more than the loss of valuable trade or national security guarantees. Korea's refusal to receive Meiji envoys signified a complete repudiation of the new Meiji regime in Tokyo. And it was this insult, the fact that the Korean king had refused to receive documents announcing the Meiji restoration, that had so angered Meiji leaders. Now, although military action in Korea was ultimately avoided, Meiji leaders did manage to force the Koreans to sign a treaty with Japan in 1876. But the important point here is that far from being this passive stepping stone in Japan's march of imperial conquest, Korea actually wielded a great deal of power, enough power, in fact, to shake the confidence and spark the indignation of Japan's early Meiji leaders. Now, the third theme of the book has to do with the focus on war and conflict. I devote a considerable amount of time and space to describing military campaigns, recounting in great detail some of the more intricate military operations of the many key battles of the First Sino-Japanese War, the China Relief Expedition, the Russo-Chinese War, and then the Russo-Japanese War, which I devote 3 chapters. Now, this was very much by design because I believe it is important to flesh out the military history of this period, partly because a detailed study of all 4 military campaigns and operations has not been extensively covered together in one book, and partly because I believe one cannot adequately appreciate this history without reckoning with the enormous consequences of these wars and their impact on societies. So in the case of the Russo-Japanese War, that war changed the character of war itself. The sheer drama of the struggle, the huge numbers of soldiers and sailors involved, the introduction of innovations such as the extensive use of barbed wire, rapid-fire weapons, and even poison gas revolutionized the very character of warfare itself to usher in modern war that presaged the utter horror of blood and destruction of World War I. So by writing a military history, I hope to show that beyond the social, economic, and cultural themes of war, the study of the operational, the logistical, the tactical, and strategic aspect of the armed forces on the battlefield are critical. For example, the tactical and strategic decisions made by Japan's military leaders during the Russo-Japanese War had a huge impact on the amount of blood that was sacrificed in the hills and valleys of Manchuria. Now, one of the arguments I make in the book is that the conflict over the direction of Japan's foreign policy after the war, whether it should become a maritime power or a continental power, and between civilian and military leaders, as well as naval and army leaders more generally, was in large part due to the tactical decisions that were made by military commanders on the ground. Now, General Nogi's Third Army suffered an astounding 93,000 casualties before Port Arthur was finally surrendered in January 1905. And rather than an unmitigated triumph, Port Arthur was a near disaster from which the Japanese army recovered only after a decision to employ both infantry and heavy military firepower to capture this crucial high ground overlooking the Russian base. So the question of whether to withdraw Japanese troops from Manchuria after the war, in light of these huge losses, I argue, directly influenced Japan's China policy and Japan's foreign policy more broadly. Now, finally, I'd like to end this presentation with some concluding thoughts of why I think the story of the other great game may be relevant to the present day. So when the Cold War ended in Europe in 1989, the notion that the course of human history had come to an end and the triumph of capitalist liberal democracy became fashionable. Closed communist societies like China and Russia were too uncreative to compete economically with the West. And so the only remaining dangers would come from rogue states like communist North Korea. It would only take a little prodding, the thinking went, for these states to jump on the modernization bandwagon and become liberal, open societies, Solancriums of America. Now, focus on the Cold War can obfuscate contemporary challenges as much as it can elucidate them, however. If Americans had expected traditional geopolitical rivalries to go away once the Cold War ended, this is because they misread what the Cold War settlement meant for China and for Russia. It was not the triumph of American-style liberal capitalist democracy over communism, but the return of revanchism and good old-fashioned great power politics. The invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 showed Russia behaving like a classic imperial power. And something similar can be said about the Asia-Pacific region, which is arguably less stable now than it was at the start of the 21st century, and for reasons that echo this past. For example, the various claims between China and Japan in the East China Sea go back to the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, when Tokyo took control of the Chinese territory of Taiwan, including the now disputed Senkaku-Gyu Islands. China's ongoing support of North Korea may also reflect a deeper desire to revive elements of the Sinocentric order that prevailed in East Asia before the arrival of Westerners and the ascent of Meiji Japan, when Korea's rulers paid an annual tribute to the Chinese court. The Korean peninsula continues to be this destabilizing presence in the region, but the main source of this instability consists of factors to which most policymakers have paid the least attention, namely issues of Korean identity, legitimacy, and nationalism, all issues that I discuss in detail in my last book that trace their origins back to the late 19th century. Thus, far from a replay of the Cold War or Cold War II, as it has become fashionably termed, the new era of great power politics is really about the settling of old scores. Putin's watershed invasion of Ukraine has thus steered history in a new direction. Not only has the crisis put a question mark behind Swiss neutrality and German pacifism, it's also opened up a large gap between the West and the rest of the world that threatens to hand the revisionist powers major opportunities in the years to come. While enthusiastic Western democracies have welcomed the imposition of draconian sanctions on Russia, many non-Western countries, including the world's two most populous states, China and India, fear the consequences of Western responses to Russian behavior more than they fear Russia itself. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping has spent much of his rule building a Sinocentric economic order through his Belt and Road Initiative, China's colossal infrastructure investments, sometimes referred to as the New Silk Road. So the trend of geopolitics thus seems to be moving against globalization in favor of a multipolar world dominated by two or three great trading blocs, similar to the late 19th century. So the story of the other great game is thus as relevant today as it was in the late 19th century, and not just because of the lessons that it offers for the potential for war and violence in the region, but for what it can teach us about the contemporary moment, the origins and legacy of Korea's bifurcated identity and perennial instability in the region, China's revanchist territorial ambitions and efforts to reassert its old position as the Middle Kingdom, Japan's role as this model of development modernization, and equally the object of loathing and suspicion, and finally, Russia's nostalgic and now shattered dreams to recover a bygone imperial era when it was a preeminent power. So with that, I'm open to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was great. You put a lot on the table. I think there'll be a good number of things to discuss. Our first discussant is Dr. Michael Robinson, Professor Emeritus of Indiana University. His research has focused on modern Korea in the early to mid 20th century, with a particular interest in the period of colonial rule between 1910 and 1945. Some of his publications include Peace Corps Volunteers in the Making of Korean Studies in the United States, published in 2020, 20th Century Odyssey, A Short History, and Colonial Modernity in Korea. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Washington Seminar, Professor Robinson. Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you very much. First, I just have to give great praise to Professor Jager's tenacity and patience in producing this volume. This is not an easy read. This is very daunting in its detail, but I think that listening to her recapitulate parts of her conclusion and go over the book shows why a patient read is really necessary to do this. I taught about Korea and East Asia for many, many years, and it was always a struggle to bring Korea into a sense of agency at the end of the 19th century, where I often began. my courses on modern Korea. And this book, after all these years, this book gave me a whole bunch of new ideas about how I might approach the teaching of modern Korean history, and partly to bring Russia in and to make the connections in the post-World War II and post-Cold War eras with this dynamic situation in late 19th century, early 20th century East Asia. I think some of the most interesting parts of the book is what she has mentioned with regard to paying a lot of attention to the warfare and the battles of these two major wars in the late and early 20th century and at the end of the 19th. I don't think people have any idea about the size of these conflicts. Often we are so Western focused that we look at World War I and the horrors of that seem to eclipse what had really anticipated it in East Asia, and particularly the last war, the Russo-Japanese War, and the introduction of all these modern killing technologies. This is just not well known, and partly because it's mentioned, these things are mentioned, but usually at paragraph length, in a history of China-Japan relationships, or Korea, Russia, China, the triangular relationship. And so I think one of her major additions to our literature is to bring that in to what one might think is a well-trodden path of talking about East Asia and the fall of Korea and its gradual absorption by the Japanese. Because as a regional history, which she could have emphasized even more, takes us away from this very tired East-West bifurcation and many of the old ideas about Western civilization advancing into a undeveloped East Asia that still pops up and characterizes some of our writing about the Far East. I think that looking at Korea in a much more detailed way as well, with emphasizing Korean domestic politics and the beginnings of a divided Korean political situation, which I worked on in my early work, she has made me a believer in the idea that this can be pushed back again into a much more lively period in Korean politics that is usually obscured by its fall. So the emphasis on the gradual weakening and the non-response of Korea to the imperial powers, the old saw of the shrimp between whales, is really an important corrective, I think. And I've been guilty of not recognizing the importance of keeping the West out to the side and looking at the regional dynamics as it emerges into the high imperialist era. So major kudos for this work. We always have to find something to criticize, but I'm still trying to think of something. The only, I think, problem with a work like this is that it would be very difficult to use in classes. First of all, students won't buy it. Secondly, to get them to read this much is very difficult. Graduate students, perhaps. But for teaching purposes, people who teach East Asia have to look at this book very carefully and to balance it with some of the older ideas that exist in our in the historiography, but also in the pedagogy of East Asian history. So with that, I'll move on to Sumi. And again, thank you for providing this wonderful book to the literature.
Michael, did you have any questions for Sheila?
Well, I'm wondering how can she's mentioned very briefly that this is a multi-volume work. It looks like a lifetime work, and I'm sure she's considering it that. But that I would really like to figure out how she deals with the colonial interwar period, in particular after World War I, in picking up the story of Japanese colonialism and its importance in terms of drawing Western conflict back into East Asia and causing American problems. And so I'd like to know what that transition is going to be, possibly World War One and the loss of German territories and other things as anticipating the era of Japanese expansion in Taiwan and Korea. So I'll leave it with that one question.
Thank you. Sheila, like to react?
So you want me to talk about World War One and East? I haven't started that book yet, so I'm not sure like how to answer going forward so much. I mean, I could. Is that what something you want me to talk about? Like how, like what my next project will be as opposed to this book?
Yeah, you've kind of left this before World War One. I mean, in the 19 teens is where you sort of closed down in the annexation of Korea, and
Right.
yeah, and so
So
again, it would be
the,
lulled into the sense that here is another break. I would want to know how you're going to find the continuities in East Asia and find out what World War One has done to propel the story forward.
okay, I can try and answer that. It's a work that I'm working on right now, but basically the next volume, so this ends in 1910, and the next volume, The Great War in East Asia, will tell the story of China, Japan's, and Korea's experiences of World War I, and specifically I'd want to understand how the war aggravated the internal political divisions within these nations and their diasporic communities, thereby sowing the seeds for future conflict in the Asia-Pacific region. So as we all know, Japan took advantage of the European powers' temporary absence from East Asia, moved into China. Shortly thereafter, Japan declared war on Germany in August 1914. It seized the German concessions of Qingdao, and then the following year, Japan, presents the 1521 demands, right, which gives Japan full control of southern Manchuria and eastern Mongolia. China then responds to this brazen Japanese encroachment by then sending 100,000 Chinese laborers to Europe and also over 200,000 laborers to Russia in 1916, and then, of course, declares war on the Allied side the following year. And in exchange, the Allied powers promise for China's declaration of war a seat at the post-war peace conference. But of course, we all know that Japan did not give up, right, Shandong at the Versailles Peace Conference. It didn't happen. And so the China-Japan connection in the Great War is this turning point, obviously, in their increasingly fraught relationship. So I lay the groundwork in this book. And then during World War I, the increasingly fraught relationship is happening between China and Japan. Now, these tensions were even further exacerbated by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and then Lenin's decision to withdraw from the war in March 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And so Japan then is invited in to join the Allied intervention, right? In Siberia, it sends over 72,000 forces into Siberia as part of the Siberian intervention. On the other hand, Chinese and Koreans also join up with the Bolsheviks to fight the Japanese in Manchuria, in Siberia. And many of the Chinese laborers who had been sent to Russia in 1916 actually defected to the Red Army and became very active members of the Chinese Communist Party upon their return. Meanwhile, Korean nationalists and communists began to fight against each other, right? There's this very famous incident in 1921, the Free Incident disaster, where nearly 600 Koreans who were associated with the Shanghai faction other Koreans. The Irkutsk faction kills the Shanghai faction. What I'm saying is that the Great War left the East Asian region even more splintered and divided than before. And so while most historians have focused on the European, or to a lesser extent, the East European front, what I want to explore is the Asian front and how the experiences of World War I reordered the East Asia, whose key features, basically a divided Korea and a divided China, still are with us today.
Well, and
that's like future.
Well, you're certainly going to pull East Asia into World War I and represent this as not bystanders, as they are often just forgotten.
Right.
Focusing. This was a world war as well in some ways.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Michael, for your comments. Before I introduce our second discussion, let me remind our viewers that you can join this conversation. Here's your chance to ask a question to one of this country's leading Koreanists by either using the raise hand function, then we'll call on you to for your question, or to post your comment or question in the Q&A function of Zoom. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague at the Wilson Center, Dr. Sumi Terry, the director of the Asia program at the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy here at the center. Dr. Terry has served in a range of important policy roles related to both Korea and its surrounding region. As senior fellow, formerly a senior fellow with the Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Here in Washington, she served as a senior analyst on Korean issues at the CIA from 2001 to 2008, where she produced hundreds of intelligence assessments, including a record number of contributions to the president's daily brief. She's also received numerous awards for her leadership and outstanding mission support, including the CIA Foreign Language Award in 2008. From 2008 to 2009, Dr. Terry was the director for Korea, Japan, and Oceanic Affairs at the National Security Council under both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. In that role, she formulated, coordinated, and implemented U.S. government policy on Korea and Japan, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania. From 2009 to 2010, she was a Deputy National Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the National Intelligence Council. That position, she led the U.S. intelligence community's production of strategic analysis on East Asian issues and authored a number of national intelligence estimates. From 2010 to 2011, she served as a National Intelligence Fellow in the David Rockefeller Studies Program at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. She has had a number of other positions, but importantly, she's now with us at the Wilson Center. And so I'm delighted to and very thankful to her to take time out of her busy schedule to join us for this conversation. Sue, over to you.
Thank you, Christian, Eric, and Michael, and Sheila. So Sheila, thank you so much. This book, I agree with Professor Robinson. It's daunting, it's massive, it's impressive, it's detailed, very detailed, it's illuminating. But since Professor Robinson just already gave very insightful comments on the book as a discussion, let me just move on to some of, because many questions, we don't have a lot of time, and I want to also be able to get to people who's watching some of their questions. But so let me start with some of the questions I have. You mentioned a lot of this, but I'm just hoping that you could just dig a little bit deeper. into some of the questions. So I wanted to begin with your thesis. Your book is a very rich portrayal of Korea's central role. And of course, overwhelmingly, the big neighbors' contest over the Korean Peninsula and influence over the Korean Peninsula over the past centuries. And of course, we've all known, China was traditional suzerain over the Korean kingdom, and Imperial Japan ruling over Korea with ruthless, this occupation in the 20th century. But your thesis, which places importance on Russia, I don't think is very well known, sort of for folks out there. And the story really begins in the year 1860, when the Russian Empire's border is expanded to the Korean Peninsula. And I think you yourself note, I think you use the word surprising choice to some historians. So I do believe that this is a very interesting choice because again, most historians have usually emphasized the impact of China and Japan on Korean history over Russia's. So we know that in the wake of the triple intervention by Russia, by Germany, by France, putting pressure on Japan, and then of course victorious Japan in the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, to retroceded the Liaodong Peninsula, led to Queen Min's overestimating Russian influence, which ultimately led to her murder by Japanese assassins. I'm getting to a point of I'm eager to learn more about the historiographical debates involved on how Russia and Japan, in their contest for control over Korea, compare in your thinking, because you have your emphasis on Russia's role. And, just if you could compare that a little bit. I'm also sort of curious of what kind of feedback you are sort of receiving from other historians of the subject. Is there some pushback, or is there mostly praise for your sort of centering Russia in this narrative in this way? I found it very interesting because that was sort of a little bit different from the other kind of history books, like your focus on Russia. So that's sort of one bucket of question. And then, I guess let me just ask.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Sure. And
Okay.
Yes,
Right. So basically, Russia's role and that the way it plays in this process. In terms of feedback, the book was just published last week, so I haven't gotten a lot of feedback yet. Hopefully, I'll get more feedback even maybe after this. So one of the central themes of the book, right, is to trace this national division back to the origins, right, to the late 19th century. And as you said, unlike most standard works, which view the origins of the division arising really from the colonial period, I look at the role that Russia played in this process of national division. And in my mind, a definite split in the nationalist movement occurred after the forced abdication of Kojong in 1907, and the subsequent disbandment of the Japanese-trained Korean army. And now, at that time, you had thousands of Korean soldiers that fled the peninsula to the Russian Far East, where they joined members of the Uibyong, or the righteous army, to fight the Japanese. Now, the Uibyong had risen up in 1895 to avenge the murder of Queen Min, right? Many of them were Confucian, literati. In any case, they rose up to fight the Japanese, and they moved to Vladivostok area. And so after the disbandment of the Korean army, they also moved, to the Russian Russian Far East. So by 1907, you have this influx of well-trained Korean soldiers who had either served with the Japanese or with the Russians. Now, the Japanese responded to these developments by then signing a treaty with Russia, first in 1907, and then in 1910, and then by annexing the peninsula to gain control over the peninsula. Now, the 1910 Russo-Japanese treaty was very significant in this regard because Russia completely reversed its support of Korean partisans in the area around Vladivostok and then initiated a harsh crackdown on them. Following the outbreak of World War I in Europe, Russia also initiated a further crackdown on these Korean partisans as Russia sought to strengthen its ties with Japan and act against a common enemy, right? Germany. Now, the October Revolution of 1917, however, changed the calculus once again. So following Russia's withdrawal from the war in March 1918 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the new Bolshevik regime then cut its ties to Japan and then gave its support to Korean anti-Japanese organizations. The Russian Civil War also provided the occasion for the Russians and the Koreans to work together again in the Russian Far East. And that's because the Bolsheviks needed allies, right? And the Korean militants helped them mount a second front against the Siberian expedition, to which the Japanese contributed a large force. So for the second time since the Russo-Japanese War, Russians and Koreans were fighting against Japan, right? And so during, you had immigration to the Russian Far East increased in the 1920s, with a large majority of Koreans concentrated in Vladivostok. So basically what I'm saying is that Russia played this huge role because it provided the space for these Korean guerrillas, right? Either the Uibyang or the righteous army, or these Korean soldiers to fight against Japan during post 1907, right? So that role plays a huge important part in this whole sort of history. Is that it? Do I answer that?
That's very, thank you for the very rich explanation. Thank you. So I think then let's bring it to the present day, because it's relatedly with this focus on Russia. And in your remarks today, and also in your epilogue, you note that today's trend of geopolitics is moving against globalization, right? In favor of multipolar world. And you say it's going to be dominated by 2 or 3 great trading blocs, like it existed in the late 19th century. And this chronicle is just relevant today as it was in the 19th century. Then you talk about China, some of the main lessons, embracing anti-imperialism, and then also I remember this phrase that was very well stated. There was like as an antidote to national humiliation, and perhaps bring Taiwan into the fold, right, to Beijing's fold. It's obviously very concerning to us. And then for Russia, Putin also looking to recapture the past glory and so on of this classic imperial power that you mentioned today. And then I think you mentioned that today the great power politics is about settling old scores. Again, very concerning to us. But so since the most pressing issue for the moment today is this, right? I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more on your thoughts on your emphasis on Russia, and also how this chronicle connects to perhaps Russia, North Korea, China versus Ukraine, US, Japan standoffs that we're having today.
Yeah, so in the epilogue of the book, I try and make this case for why I think the other great game is relevant to the current geopolitical moment, and why I believe the current focus on, for example, rehashing Cold War tropes is ultimately unproductive. So under the facade of this commitment to global democracy, we shouldn't obviously ignore the opinions of peoples across the non-Western world, including democracies like India or Brazil or South Africa. It's not that these people in these countries approve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's that they don't perceive such a huge difference between the regional hegemonic ambitions and criminal actions, frankly, of Russia and the actions of the United States, particularly after Iraq and Afghanistan. So although we Americans might like to call this new geopolitical landscape Cold War II, with all the familiar tropes about democracy versus autocracy, good versus evil, us versus them, I'm not sure most of the world, and that by that I mean the global South, actually sees it this way. So this new multipolar era, heightened by competition between 2 or more great powers, is similar, as I said, that has gone on before. That is, great powers doing what they've always done by furthering their own national interests. And that said, I think the main difference between this era of great power politics and the one that I wrote about in my book is that today's revisionist powers are all about the settling of old scores, right? As For China, it's Taiwan. Taiwan is linked not just to the Civil War, but it's linked to this devastating period when it was forced to relinquish both Taiwan and Korea to Japan, thus effectively ending its hegemonic position as the Middle Kingdom. And as for Russia, it's all about the humiliation suffered at the end of the Cold War and the right to reclaim territory that belonged to the former Tsarist Empire. But I think beyond Russian and Chinese revanchism, I think American and European responses to the current moment is also very instructive, because the new buzzword in American and European political circles is this concept of de-risking, right? And it seems to mean reducing dependency on China for like essential goods and commodities. Now, such ideas, I think, demonstrate that we are entering this new multipolar geostrategic landscape with a familiar player, again, Korea, being caught once in the middle. Because despite, the friendly state visit between, President Yoon Suk-yeol and Biden a few weeks ago, South Korea has actually been very hesitant to back the United States arming of Ukraine. South Korea, as I think as you can tell me, is the second largest or second biggest arms exporter after China, and so far has refused requests from Washington and NATO to supply Ukraine with lethal weapons. South Korea has also been far more circumspect than other American allies to distance itself from China. And unlike Japan, South Korea has not imposed curbs on semiconductor technology sales to China. So all this is, of course, understandable because China is South Korea's largest trade partner, and supply chains for some of South Korea's most important industries, like semiconductors, are largely China-based, right? So, Washington's effort to isolate China, using this term de-risking or otherwise, I think is extremely problematic for South Korea. Even for American allies, it's problematic. And so all this is to underscore the epithet that, Cold War II and this implied battle between democracy versus autocracy really fails to completely capture the complexity of the current geopolitical moment. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Do I have time for one more question, and then I'll?
Sure.
I was just curious if you could share with us. I just think it would be really interesting because you have so many incidents, like just one or two of the many incidents that you talk about, and so many people in your book that matter most to your analysis. I know it's really, really hard to do. But I know, like, for example, you spent some time talking about the Boxer Rebellion, but that's, I wonder if there's one or two incidents that really matter the most from your perspective. And then in terms of people, sort of what is the role of the powerful personalities, right, in Japan, Russia, and China that has influence over Korea? And I wonder if you would say, on the whole, perhaps, especially in autocracies, where the powerful persons dictate policy far more than institutions or world events, So I guess my question is, who are some of the undeniably powerful Japanese, Russian, Chinese who have shaped Korea's future, or or for most powerful Korean leaders who have shaped the future course, you would say? So just kind of, either incidents or people that matter most to your analysis. I'm curious because it's like, this is a big book. For I thought people might be interested to know.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting when you're writing a narrative history, you get very invested in people and persons. And so for me, the personalities that I really loved was Sergei Witte, because he was, in a sense, constantly in conflict with Nicholas II. And of course we know which personality should have won out, but Nicholas, of course, won. And the fact that
explain for a moment who he was for those.
Sergei Witte was the Tsar Nicholas's finance minister, and he was the person who advised Nicholas II not to engage in the Russo-Japanese War. And of course, he was sacked. And Nicholas went on and decided to, on his stupidity, and then challenged Japan. So, I guess, in terms of like Korean personalities, I really liked the Taewon-gun. I know that he was not a very nice figure. I mean, people talk about him being very brutal, but he was certainly an extremely colorful figure that I liked. I also really liked Queen Min.
That's why there's a lot of Korean dramas with both characters.
Oh, I mean, it's just incredible.
Dramas, yeah.
And they're constantly, and the fact that, you know, that the Taewon-gun tried to overthrow his son, I think it was 4 times, right? And yet Ko Jong could not do anything really about it because of his Confucian upbringing. He couldn't censor his father. And so you have this situation where these two personalities are debating and arguing amongst each other, threatening each other, while the outside powers are, you know, encroaching on Korea, and their inability to do anything about it because of this family strife. So, you know, would Ko Jong, would he have been a better leader without his father? I think probably he would have, right? I don't know. Am I answering your question, sort of? Or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I make a quick point from the previous question? Is that Korea's centrality, once again, in this era of multi-power competition in East Asia, is no longer from the position of being inert as a colony or a possession, but now both North and South Korea are really power players. South Korea both militarily and trade-wise, but North Korea now is a nuclear power. And so this is a major difference, but more complicating, I think, than to have Korea just sort of there around which everybody is. You know, both of those countries are being pulled into this conflict.
Well, what I tried to say, though, is that that's been a pattern in Korean history from the very beginning, where you have these two power brokers, like Queen Min, for example, and she's taking Russia to help her, you know, boast her position, right? And then you have the progressives who are looking to Japan. So it's always because the domestic problems in Korea can't be resolved, but they're too weak to be able to resolve them themselves. They then pull in outside powers to resolve domestic disputes. And that pattern, you can go all the way to Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung, right? And so that is I don't want to say it's a fated pattern, but it is a definite pattern in Korean history.
Thank you. Thank you both for your questions and comments. Again, to our viewers, join us now using the raise hand function or post your comment in the Q&A function. We'd love to bring you into this conversation. Let's first go to Marlene Mayo. Marlene Mayo, if you could please unmute yourself. We can't hear you unless you unmute yourself. Please hit the, yes, there you go.
Hello. I didn't really call for a question, so I'm rather startled.
Oh, well.
However, I did a long time ago, pretentiously, write about the 1873 debate in Japan by members of the returning Iwakura mission and the followers of Saigo Takamori, who had stayed behind. And that particular article is often cited. It's the most cited of the articles I've written, and that is a long time ago. And it was based on my doctoral dissertation. And so I'm rather eager to read this new book to find out to what extent, after all these years have gone by, my particular conclusions have been revised, thrust aside, or perhaps reinterpreted. But it did seem to me, if I heard correctly, that there was too much emphasis upon the Saigo group in talking about the debate of 1873 and not the returning members of the Iwakura mission who were very much against sending an expedition to Korea to protest over the failure to receive the credentials of the Meiji Emperor. So it's just a side comment, and I'm concerned and really interested in the recent and exceptional interest in South and North Korea, and very much aware that many of the courses in East Asia civilization have to be transformed or very much revised to incorporate much more material on Korea.
Thank you very much for an impromptu question that was quite good. So, Sheila, over to you.
Yeah, I know that essay, and I actually did use Professor Mayo's work. I was very it was very inspiring for me in my work. But I guess what you're asking is, well, one of the themes, I'll just go back. So one of the themes of the book is again, to de-emphasize this East-West dynamic and to, as the instigator of change in East Asia, and to focus much more intensely on this regional, right, dynamic between the regional players. And of course, as I said in my introduction, the most standard histories of modern Japan, Perry's black ship remains the predominant symbol of Japan's entrance, right, into the modern world. And so the story really begins with this Japan's forced incorporation into the treaty port imperialism introduced by Western powers, and Japan's then swift response to the Western challenge by becoming an imperial power itself. But to attribute, I think, the actions of Meiji leaders to the threat of invasion is to misconstrue the principal concerns of Meiji leaders at the time. And that is, the principal concern in the founding of the new Meiji regime was not just to repel foreign invasion, rather it was to bring about this internal rejuvenation, renovation of Japan, right? And that's why they dubbed it, their enterprise, Meiji Restoration, Meiji Ishin, right? And so in this context, I think foreign relations were significant first and foremost for their bearing upon what they had on the primary aim of internal rejuvenations. So considered in this light, I think key events in the history of Japanese imperialism take on a completely new light. So for example, as I talked about in the introduction, the 1873 debate over the proposed invasion of Korea, the so-called Seikonlan debate, which is so far, at least in Korean historiography, has been viewed as this principal point of departure for Japanese imperialist expansion. I say, and I think Professor Mayo would say, it was not really about imperialism at all. It's true, the true significance of that controversy had very little to do with Japan's later continental expansionism. And instead, the controversy had everything to do with Japan's nation building efforts. So what Meiji leaders hoped to obtain was an external confirmation of the new Meiji state through a renewal of contacts with Korea. And the fact that the Korean king refused to do so really marked a direct repudiation of the new Japanese regime in Tokyo. And so the proposed military invasion to Korea in 1873 was thus intended primarily to avenge a national insult, right, symbolized by Korea's refusal, right, to receive documents from the Japanese empire or emperor. So while I don't want to downplay the threat that the West posed to Japan or Japan's desire to become an imperial power, I think to draw this retrospective line between Japanese imperialism of the 1930s through Japanese colonialism, colonization of Korea in 1910, way back to the 1870s, completely distorts the historical record. So what I really wanted to emphasize in the book was that there were several competing, often contradictory paths that Japan could have taken on its journey towards continental expansionism. And these paths were taken more out of opportunity and contingency than out of any sort of preordained pattern of behavior.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Sam Wells next. Sam, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sheila, I've enjoyed greatly. You hear me?
Yes,
Yep,
I do.
I can hear you.
Hi,
Okay.
Sam.
Hi. Enjoyed your presentation very much. It answered some lingering questions I had about how the Russians got so entangled with North Korea. But I've got two sort of marginal questions to your main themes, but I'm wondering, given the salience of the current Taiwan issue and the fact that I'm working on the origins of the American defense commitment, if Koreans had any response to the Japanese takeover there, as well as their takeover of the German concessions on the mainland. And a second issue that, again, is even more marginal is the United States was engaged in a pretty nasty suppression effort in the Philippines at this time. Did Koreans or Japanese have any interest or involvement in that particular rather unattractive episode that the American Marines and Army went through? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can answer the first question because I am not au courant with all the contemporary stuff. But in terms of what you're talking about with the Philippines, I don't know how to frame this, but I think that in the buildup to the Russo-Japanese War, right, Japan sought alliances and friendships with the world's great maritime powers, and that was, of course, Britain and the United States. And Japan also embraced the principles of the open door. This was also, as you just said, it was a period of U.S. Expansionism after the Spanish-American War, when Japan, U.S. secured the Philippines. The United States also took Wake Island, Hawaii, Guam, right, and the so-called coaling stations to secure trade and commerce with China. So by allying itself with Britain and the United States, the Japanese really saw themselves as this great commercial and maritime power. Admiral Togo's victory in the Battle of Tsushima that essentially ended the Russo-Japanese War also was far greater and more spectacular than anything that General Oyama had achieved in Manchuria. And so that victory also enhanced the Navy's visibility with and navalism. So I guess what I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but yes, Japan really saw itself in alignment with these great maritime powers, the United States and Britain, and it was that support actually that allowed them then to take on Russia in 1904. Am I answering your question, or?
I think Sam signed off, so
Okay.
we hope so.
Okay.
Let me pose a question by an anonymous viewer. In your view, were there any missed opportunities not seen or taken advantage of in the late 1800s and 1900s Korea that would have resulted in greater resolution of conflicts that face East Asia today? And how can these be readily applied to the regional and transnational issues of the 2020s?
What missed opportunities there could have been during this period?
In the late 1800s and 1900s Korea that would have resulted in greater resolution of conflicts that face East Asia today?
Well, I think going back again to the Korea theme as the source of conflict, I think the greater resolution would have come about between Korean leadership. I mean, Kojong, when he was in the 1870s, right out, he wanted to have a better relationship with Japan, and so if Kojong had been able to take that path, things might have been very different. But his father, the Taewongun, did not agree with it, and then you had the Imo uprising, right, which brought then the Japanese and the Chinese into the peninsula. That then at that point, all these two powers are already involved in Korea. So I think that the missed opportunity was the fact that that Kojong could not control his father, and that Kojong and that the Taewongun opposed his father. I mean, I think that is sort of the crux, because it was that instability in Korean domestic politics that then led to everything that happened much later.
So it's a really interesting, Sheila. I was just in Seoul and I was talking to someone, pretty high-ranking Korean who was lamenting Korea's own history and basically said, we are a country that without firing a shot lost our country.
Mm-hmm.
And then also regained our country without
Regaining
it. Like it was
Right,
completely
right,
like they
right.
took it away, and then even just gaining independence was through. So there's sort of this kind of lament and sadness and or recognition over what you're just talking about. That just there was a lot of domestic politics inaptitude and
Right.
just. So this is, I'm just saying, I agree with you. It's just kind of interesting.
Right. But I think what's interesting about that is that I'm trying to give Koreans agency in this. It is, Ko Jong did want a relationship with Japan, right? He wanted to follow. And there were many progressives, Kim Ok-kyun and Soh Jae-pil. These were progressive Koreans who wanted a different vision for Korea. Unfortunately, they also allied themselves with Japan, right? Because they didn't have the support within the domestic sphere because they were fighting constantly with these conservatives. So on the one hand, you can lament this, but as Korea's as sort of victims of these great power plays, but at the same time, they were authors of their own tragedy as well. And that gives, that's also, Korea does have agency here. It's not just that it was the shrimp among whales, but that they themselves, in a sense, sort of created this domestic instability that then forced other powers to come into Korea to resolve them.
Jong is overlooked as a modernizer. He was very interested in reforms, very linked with the progressive wing.
Mm-hmm.
Without the opposition of his father and conservatives in the court, you could see a future evolving with Korea and Japan, maybe Japan the major partner here, but not colonized.
Mm-hmm.
And what that might have led to is very interesting to think about, but of course counterfactual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Neil Silver asks, what weight and importance do you accord to British anti-Russianism in the late 19th century and its knock-on effect on the new emerging power, the US, in arguably Britain's and US's consciously, politically, and financially leaning to one side, the Japanese side? So did Britain and the US, by leaning on, supporting, accepting the Japanese side, sow dragon's teeth when the 20th and 30s domestic issues in Japan led to Japan's new militaristic direction?
That's a really good question. Yes, and the answer is yes. During the Russo-Japanese War, of course, Japan would never have taken on Russia without the support. The first step of Japan's decision to take on Russia was the Anglo-Japanese alliance, right, in 1902. So without that British support and that alliance, Japan would never have done so. And of course, for the Americans, they were interested in trade in Manchuria, right? And they were suspicious of the Russians in Manchuria as well. And of course, the Russians by then had built the Trans-Siberian Railway, right? Which both threatened not only Japan, it was threatening to American trade there. And so here we have Japan being sort of the foot soldier in Asia to be able to take on the Russian bear when for support of the open door, right? And so very much Japan would not have was backed by these powers, right? Both the United States and Britain, in order to take on Russia, because Russia itself was an enemy of Britain, as well as exasperated President Roosevelt.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Chris Nitschke for your question. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm an Americanist by training, so I really appreciate that you give us the Russian and Korean perspective. It seemed to me like East Asia and therein especially Korea was always some sort of quarrelsome platform for imperial performance sort of in the eyes of others. So I was just wondering if you could explain or speculate about the lasting reasons why that was the case in the 19th century and still is today, if I understood you correctly, and how Korea's domestic politics have shaped those reasons.
I'm not sure I quite understand the first part of the question. So why was Korea? Can you repeat that again?
I mean, maybe I understood that incorrectly. That from what I heard in the talk here, is that it seemed to me that East Asia was, and Korea, I guess, that Korea was always sort of a very inviting sort of platform for others to sort of play out their, as you mentioned, their nation building and their imperial performances on. So I'm wondering, if I understood that correctly, if you can explain why that was the case in the 19th century and still is today, with recourse to Korea's domestic politics, since that's an emphasis in the book.
Well, I'm not sure if I can answer that for the 20th century, but basically, since after the Manchu invasions of 1637, so Korea sort of becomes isolates itself, and its only relationship is really with China. It has an independent relationship with Korea, with Japan in this the exchange trade in Tsushima, but so it was basically an isolated society with tributary relations with China. What comes into what the new dynamic in this that changes everything, as I said, is not the East-West challenge. It's that Russia takes this huge swath of territory after the Second Opium War, the Usurian and Amur region, from China in the 1860s, and that creates this new border with Korea. And so at that point, both China and Japan wonder, what does this Russian border with Korea mean? And that then spins this whole question about how do they relate to, or how are they going to go against this challenge? How are they going to respond to this challenge? So that border then becomes sort of the beginning of the story.
So would you say, to answer his question in very simple terms, that Korea's geography actually if you just look at the map, that explains a whole lot. And this is why, it just is no other way. Like, so even for Japan, you mentioned this in your book, when you go through the history, some of the old, like even when the Hideyoshi's invasions and whatnot, there's no other way to get to China but through Korea. So it just makes a lot of sense when Russia's border is right there. I mean, it's just this, look at the map, right? So it's kind of, geography does play a very important role.
Of course. I don't think that geography is a determinant of history, but of course in this, Korea is smack in the middle, right? There's China, Russia, and Japan. So obviously it has to respond to these great powers. So geography is, in that sense, yes, it's a given. But how the Koreans responded to it, I think, could have changed things differently. But
Thank
yes,
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Charles Hayford takes us back a little further. He asks, does this period that you're writing about also rhyme with the Greater East Asia War of the late 16th century with its Manchu, Ming, Korean, and Japanese wars?
Well, yes, you can say that goes back. Korea, it's not that uniquely Korea has been the object of great power plays in the 1950s during the Korean War, or even the Russia-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War. It goes way back to the Indian invasions, right, of the late 16th century. We can go further back to the Mongols, right, in the 13th century. The Mongolian invasion of Korea in the 13th century was not to invade Korea; it was to invade Japan. Luckily, the Japanese were saved because of the kamikaze winds, right, the typhoons twice, and Korea, of course, got the butt of it. So there was constant, I mean, Koreans were constantly being invaded. And the Imjin Wars, I mean, that was a truly devastating war for the Koreans. I think they lost something like 2 to 3% of their population during that period. So the Koreans and Japanese were constantly going up and down the peninsula to get to the other side. So the Japanese went up during the Hideyoshi invasions to attack Ming China, and then the Mongols and the Manchus went down to attack Japan.
Thank you. Steve Traver asks, will tribalism between historic groups in Korea, such as that currently in Afghanistan, be a significant factor in the development of an eventual settlement?
I'm not quite sure what that means, tribalism.
Well, I think that's probably what you should. I'm not sure that analogy works, but.
Yeah. I'm not sure if tribalism exists in Korea. It's such a, it's one race. I don't know. It's
one race, one culture, one language.
Right. So I don't know if this is a relevant, what do you call it? Like,
right.
Analogy
that works. Right. Good. Question from Stephen Hattes. I'd like to hear more about the current supply chain situation, China, South Korea, as if it has historical roots. This was mentioned in the talk. Are there further resources that could be recommended for my research?
He was saying the
current supply chain situation, China, South Korea.
Oh, the current supply chain situation. Well, I mean, I think I'm. Last I heard, President Yoon Suk-yeol said that maybe he would now allow South Korea to give lethal weapons to Ukraine, but it would have to be if the Russians did some terrible civilian massacres. I'm not sure exactly what the status of what South Korea's relationship or what South Korea's commitment to that is, but basically what I said in the talk is China and South Korea are very close trading partners. And so this whole idea of inserting the Cold War analogy of autocracy versus democracy doesn't really work in a situation where you have an ally of the United States, which is so dependent and so not dependent, but so embedded right in the economy of China. And so how are you going to say what de-risking of China? You're going to tell the South Koreans not to, sell their stuff to China. So I mean, basically, the whole point was that this whole Cold War analogy doesn't actually work in this context, and the great power analogy I think is a lot better to describe what's happening today.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Let me just see. There's just one more question by an anonymous attendee asking, what do you think of former President Trump's attempt to unilaterally settle the North Korean issue around 2018? Can you look back to domestic and international history for the situation in North Korea as concerned settlement?
About Trump's policy in I think it was
his efforts in 2018 to settle the issue unilaterally.
I think it was silly and stupid. I think he had no understanding of the complexities of North-South relationship, and so he gave a huge platform for North Korea, and the United States got nothing for it. I'm not sure though that has anything to do with the book. I mean, that's just my opinion, right? This is just like opinions on current affairs.
Thank you. As I said, we're just about out of time. I'd like to ask you, Sheila, you've criticized the Cold War tropes, and in terms of the current policy, I'd love to push you a little bit, based on your extensive research for the book and all the other research you've done. Could you suggest a positive policy approach for the United States in this situation, based on your reading of this history?
Okay, I'll give a stab at it. I'm not a policy person, and I'm a historian, but I'll give a stab. So everyone now talks about Taiwan, right? Taiwan. But like Taiwan, which was taken from China by Japan in 1895, following its defeat of the First Sino-Japanese War, the loss of the Amuri and Usuri regions in 1860 also evolved bad memories. Evoke very bad memories. It's again this reminder of China, that when China was weak and defenseless against the relentless incursions of foreign powers, including Russia. So Putin's invasion has inadvertently provided Xi Jinping with this opportunity to rewrite this history. So despite these claims of their rock-solid relationship, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has thrust Russia in this very dangerous dependent relationship vis-a-vis China. And this dependency has very significant implications, I think, regarding the status of the Russian Far East. These tensions aren't new. China began questioning the legitimacy of the Sino-Soviet border as far back as the 1960s, right, when Mao Zedong announced that it was the product of unequal treaties, and then launched an undeclared war with the Soviet Union along the Usuri River. And so no matter how the war in Ukraine is going to unfold, there's no denying that the crisis has also opened up this new opportunity for China. And so the war may yet forestall Beijing's aggressive moves on Taiwan, but Putin's ill-conceived war has all but guaranteed Russia's junior partner status, which has provided this opportunity for Russia to aggressively move into the Russian Far East. So, in other words, Chinese revanchism isn't confined to the West. It's also applied to Russia. And so if the Americans were smart about it, they could find a way, just like during the Sinos, with Nixon, they find a way to leverage this history between China and Russia, because that huge territory is just as Chinese as Taiwan, right? And so, the history of Russia's exploitation of China in the 19th century really, I think, is very important to this story that we can't also forget. Does that sort of answer your question?
It does. Thank you. I think that brings our conversation to an end. Unfortunately, there are a few more questions in the Q&A, but we're out of time. My thanks to you, Sheila Miyoshi Jager,
Thank you.
Michael Robinson, and of course, Sumi Terry, for a terrific, rich conversation this afternoon. This concludes this semester's Washington History Seminar. We have a really, really great lineup for the fall. We'll be announcing it soon. Hope to see you then. Until then, stay safe. We're adjourned. Take care.